My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, Embracing the Saviour Who Stays the Same When Everything Else Changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievein.com. You are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my friend Mike Kruger, or Dr. Michael J. Kruger, as he is formerly known, and Mike holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, which, if you've never been to Edinburgh, it's just one of the most beautiful places in the world, which I doubt is why Mike went there, but is a lovely side effect of studying in Edinburgh. He is president and a professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he's one of the leading scholars today in the study of the origins of the New Testament. He is the author of numerous books, including Bully Pulpit, Confronting the Problem of Spiritual Abuse in the Church, which came out in 2022, Surviving Religion 101, which came out in 2021, appropriately enough, Hebrews for You, which came out also in 2021, and Christianity at the Crossroads, How the Second Century Shaped the Future of the Church, which came out in 2018. That's a book that I actually often kind of look back to and refer to in my own writings. And Mike is the author of the forthcoming book, Miniature Codices in Early Christianity, which will be published by Oxford University Press in, I believe, June of this year. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. They're saying sometime in the spring or summer. You know how these things go, probably April, May, or June. It should be on the shelves, so to speak. But with Oxford, there's no on the shelf. In most places, you have to order it. But right. Yeah, it's forthcoming.
Fantastic. We had an episode of this podcast earlier this season where we were looking at the benefits and the way to sort of get going with reading the Bible for yourself. And one of the things that it's always useful to just recognize, even as we think about reading the Bible for ourselves, is that for the majority of Christian history, or at least for a large portion of Christian history, a large proportion of Christians haven't had the kind of access to the Bible that we have today, in the sense of like having easy access to physical copies of the whole Bible. I guess as pretty much anyone listening to us today either has in their house already or could easily get into their house one or more copies of the Bible in their own language in a way that, you know, they could easily read. And that hasn't been the case, obviously, for much of Christian history. And I'd love you to start with, Mike, by telling us a little bit about your new book and the kind of interesting angle it takes on what might be termed sort of pocket Bibles, or at least pocket portion Bibles that were being made by Christians pretty early on in Christian history. Sort of fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, it is stunning to think about how different things are today. People don't realize the privilege they have to have Bibles so easily accessible to them in their own language. We tend to think of Bibles as something someone puts under their arm and takes to church with them and then opens it up during the sermon or something like this and follows along, or maybe reading it in a chair. And now you can read it on your phone or on your tablet. This was not the way in the ancient world it was typically done. In the ancient world, most people couldn't read, for one. And so you lived on a largely illiterate culture. And that was true for the early Christian movement, was also true for the broader Greco-Roman world. Most people just couldn't read. And so you would get the Bible through other means, mostly public reading, someone who was literate around you that could read and would be able to read the Bible for you, or you hear it read at church. So these are the kind of things that people typically did to get the scriptures in their own ears, so they could hear what it had to say. And so that's a really sort of rare idea to have the Bible around. But there were exceptions to that. In my new book, you mentioned it, Miniature Codices in Early Christianity. It sounds so technical, and it really is technical, but the basic assumptions of it are pretty simple to understand. That is that Christianity as an early culture was much more textually oriented than we give it credit for. They lived in a world where religion was not typically associated with books. We tend to think that's normal. That's not normal. In the ancient world, books and religion were not sort of seen as something that went together. Well, Christianity inherited a textual religion from Judaism, but then started to value their own books. And what I study in that volume is how they began to create pocket versions of these books so they could use them, read them, wear them, carry them with them on journeys, and have them with them even when they slept in bed at night. And there was a sense in which Christians were doing all kinds of things to be with their books and to have their books with them, because they saw them as a conduit to God. They saw them as containing God's word, and to be with a book from God is to, in a sense, be with God. So it was a very interesting insight to the culture of the early Christian world, and shows you how much they valued their books.
My eldest daughter is fascinated with the biblical languages and has been sort of teaching herself Greek and Hebrew. And we had a really fun visit to the Museum of the Bible in DC a few months ago, where one of the things she was able to do is sort of see some of the massive like Torah scrolls and other sort of Old Testament book manuscripts that were used in synagogues, where people would sort of have these massive kind of rollers and be able to sort of shift where the text was that they were reading at various points. But obviously, so you're saying like a kind of public reading of scripture that was very much part of Jewish culture, sort of flowing into Christian culture, but like the polar opposite of portable. And you're saying
right.
that one of the things that early Christians were sort of trying to do more and more was to find ways to have scripture kind of with them in a physical form. Help us think about that in the context of like how early Christian beliefs were developing. I know that there was a very kind of rapid spread of Christianity all over the place in its very earliest stages, that leads to a lot of kind of variety of practices and all sorts of kind of interesting things going on as people figure out like, what does it mean to be a Christian in the cultural context that they're in? Did you have any particularly sort of fun insights from your research on that?
Yeah, well, you're right about the big codices and big scrolls for Judaism. We have examples of these. We know that would not have been portable, that you would read in a synagogue. In the early Christian movement, it didn't take long for Christians to develop codices of fairly significant sizes. Particularly, we think of the big 4th century codices like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are names of two massive codices you would never carry with you. They were enormous, and they held both Old and New Testament books. And so Christians had that. But here's one of the things that made Christianity unique as an early movement. It wasn't just its textual orientation, which I already mentioned, which was foreign to the Greco-Roman world. The idea that you would tie your religion to a book like that just didn't register with people. That wasn't something they would have felt like you would want to do. But the other thing that Christians did that was really unique to Christians is they traveled. They traveled a lot. They journeyed a lot. And the reason for doing this was to spread, of course, the Christian message and to take the gospel to the various places that had never heard it. But on top of that, they weren't just traveling with the Christian message in their head. They were traveling with the Christian message in their books. So they needed books that were portable, books that could be carried, books that could be used. And so as Christianity emerges, yes, we see these massive codices that you would use in a church pulpit, probably never get moved. It would be there on display, very visual. You'd see it on a worship setting. Okay, that's not going anywhere. But in terms of the day-to-day operational life of the average believer in the ancient world who was trying to spread the good news, they would want to carry books with them, and they would want to read from them, and they'd want them to be convenient and accessible and lightweight that they could take on their journeys. And from what we can tell, these miniature codices would have served that function. They would have been an example of how the text of the word would have spread more than just by word of mouth. It would have physically been taken with early Christians as they traveled around the early Christian world. So we have a lot of these testimonies of Christians traveling with books, and it's fascinating. They carry them around their neck, and they carry them in their pocket. They carry them in these little bags, these little saculas in Latin, and they have these little places they carry their books, and they certainly would have been modest-sized books to function that way.
Gosh, that's fascinating. What would you say to somebody who said, okay, look, when I think about the texts that we have kind of gathered together in our Bibles, let's say looking at the New Testament texts, when you buy a Bible from a store today, you get the impression that this is all one very kind of unified, clear collection that is sort of unchanging, and that you've received this, from the very lips of the original writers or from their very pens. But, some of the scholars in this area, most famously folks like Bart Ehrman, would say, well, actually, when we look at the history of the sort of textual transmission of like how these texts have kind of come down to us through the centuries, we really can't have the kind of confidence that we pretend to have today in the New Testament being, authentic to what was originally being written, because there were so many different manuscripts that were copied in so many different places way, way later than the originals were written. We don't have any of the original copies of, say, the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life or the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote that are included in the New Testament. So how can we possibly be confident that what we read in a Bible today bears any real resemblance to what was written and what was being transmitted in that very earliest sort of generation of the church? What would you say to somebody who had that kind of skepticism or that reason for not taking the New Testament seriously?
Yeah, it's a common argument. It's certainly Ehrman's favorite argument. He's not the only one to have made it. There's lots of ways to challenge the historical nature of the New Testament. One is to challenge its content. Is it saying true things? What Ehrman does that, of course, but what he challenges mostly is not so much whether what it says is true, but whether we have what it says. Do we have the words of the original authors in our hands now? And he will appeal to the multiplicity of copying mistakes and scribal errors that have crept in to the text and so on. And this has been one of his standard arguments. But I think if someone takes all of that and only hears Ehrman's side of it and only hears that particular perspective on it, they will have missed out on a lot of things that made Christianity remarkable. Because one of the things we know about the early Christian world, as I've already begun to discuss, it was a very textual culture and had a really sophisticated textual and book copying environment. So this idea that early Christians were sort of, illiterate, uneducated, sort of couldn't read or write, and were trying to stumble through this copy process with no real professionalism and made a bunch of mistakes, and who knows what we have today, does not have any sort of bearing on what really happened in the ancient world, because that's not what happened in the ancient world. We have evidence that the Christian scribal culture was fairly sophisticated. One of the things that bears this out is the care that scribes took in copying their books. We see corrections in the manuscripts. We see certain scribal habits uniformly used across the empire of early Christianity. And we see a stability in the text that's really remarkable. And because of the great evidence we have of early Christian manuscripts, we can track this stability pretty reliably. So people who are skeptical about the early Christian text would have to be skeptical about every text under the sun. They have to be skeptical about basically anything we think we know about ancient history, because it all comes from texts that were hand copied. And I think there's good evidence for how Christians took really great care in copying their books. And the reason we know that is because we can see them. We have early manuscripts go all the way back to the 2nd century, and that's really remarkable.
Mm-hmm. How does the geographic spread of Christianity help us with that as well? In my understanding, the fact that we have very similar texts from very different places kind of helps us chart back to original sources. But tell us more about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think speaks to the consistency of the early Christian sort of scribal infrastructure is the consistency of texts across various locales. So we have evidence of the texts in various locations, some of which end up mainly in Egypt, because that's where most of the manuscripts, the remnants of them are found. But we know they come from different locations. And we also have church fathers testifying to the stability of the text and their different locations. And so the idea that someone could have controlled the early Christian textual transmission and made it how they wanted it to be, right? Like as if someone fabricated it or manipulated it or tried to edit it in such a way that fit their own views or something like this. You have the text too spread out over different parts of the ancient world to manipulate it that way. And this is actually testifies to its stability. I mean, we see its impact in different areas, and these places agree with one another. And I think that shows you that there's not some sort of conspiracy theory that says that Christians sort of got together and manipulated their text and took out all the parts they didn't like and then made it how they wanted it or something like that. No, the text was already out there. You could not have sort of manipulated it after the fact, but Christians were careful to copy it faithfully when they did have it, and we have evidence to that.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. You'll sometimes hear these figures about the number of differences between manuscripts, and I think Bart Ehrman often sort of quotes sort of like 5,000 or thereabouts sort of different or scribal errors or differences between manuscripts, and it sounds like you would think, oh well, from that, how could we possibly be confident that any New Testament text is consistent with what was originally written? But many of these differences are actually extraordinarily minute, right? Like, so there are differences as to whether you would say Jesus or the Jesus. In my understanding, correct me if I'm misremembering, that might be sort of very minor kind of grammatical differences that don't make any essential difference to the text itself, and that there would be some like legitimate scribal errors made in copying that you would see in one place, but if you compare across different manuscripts from enough places, you can kind of figure out what would have been, in the large majority of cases, you can figure out what the original would have been.
No, that's right. So Ehrman loves to talk about numbers, and he uses numbers that are really mind-blowing, something around the level of 400,000 textual variants out there in our manuscript tradition. And he often makes the point that there's more variants than there are words in the New Testament. And this is the danger of statistics, right? Because on a technical level, he's right. We do have a lot of textual variations in the hundreds of thousands level, and more than we do of words in the New Testament. But there's a lot of pieces of that aren't included. One of them you mentioned, which is the vast majority of these are very minor variations, often to do with spelling. You mentioned a variation had to do with the way Greek uses the definite article, which is one of the ways that these variants happen. Some of the variants happen to do with word order, which is a little bit secondary in Greek because of the way Greek declines its nouns. But also one of the biggest textual variants, and some scholars have estimated up maybe 3/4 of all these textual variations are spelling differences or spelling errors. And one of the things I point out to my students all the time is that even when you have a spelling error, that doesn't change necessarily the meaning. And oftentimes you fix spelling errors in your head, sometimes even intuitively, so fast you don't even notice that they're a spelling error. But you don't throw away the whole book as you're unreliable because you find spelling mistakes in it. I remember my son years ago when he was younger, he's grown now, but when he was still at home, he would read in bed at night. And I remember one night I was walking by his room and he said, "Dad, come here for a second." So I went in there and he was reading a book. I won't mention the title of the book, but this is probably one of the best-selling books of all time, probably north of 100 million copies in print, I would guess. And he's reading this book and he says, "Dad, I found a spelling mistake." And I thought, no, you didn't. You didn't find a spelling mistake. There's no way this book has been edited so carefully and so long. Will you ever find a spelling error in this book? And he goes, "No, I really did." So sure enough, I looked at it and he was right. There was a mistake in this book. And I was stunned. I wish looking back, I had sort of cataloged kind of the mistake and where I found it. But I was blown away by the fact there was a mistake in the book. But here's one thing he didn't do. He didn't say, "Well, I guess this book is meaningless now." Or he didn't say, "I don't have any idea what this book means. I don't have any idea what the author's trying to say." No, these things happen when you transmit things, even in the modern day. Can you imagine in the ancient world? But you intuitively correct them. So one of the things to realize is what you indicated. Most of these mistakes are trivial and don't affect the meaning of the text. Here's the other thing that's left out of the statistics argument is the question of how we know we have so many textual variants. Like, why do we know about hundreds of thousands of textual variants? Because we have so many manuscripts. This is the thing that people don't realize, is the more manuscripts you have of an ancient document, the more opportunity there is to discover scribal variations. And the New Testament has so many more manuscripts than comparable texts in the ancient world. We have over 5,700 copies of the New Testament now, which is just a mind-blowing number. I know your audience may not have a category for that number, but the average document from that time period, we might have 10 to 20 copies of. We have north of 5,000 of the New Testament. So every one you find, you have an opportunity to find a new scribal slip. So the fact we know about so many textual variants is because we know so much about our New Testament text. Yeah, so you can't blame the New Testament tradition for having so many copies and then use that as an argument against it. So I find that to be misleading when people do that.
Yeah, I find the conversation about spelling encouraging as somebody who is exceedingly bad at spelling. And it's particularly embarrassing to be bad at spelling when you have like multiple degrees in English literature. My only defense is that I studied Shakespeare for my PhD, and
there's a lot of spelling variations there.
Right. So in early modern literature in English, there is no real standardization of spelling. Shakespeare spelled his own name multiple different ways.
Well, that's how it was in the ancient world with Greek, by the way. There's a lot of these so-called spelling errors aren't really errors. Actually, they're actually variants in spelling that were common in the Greek world. One of the classics is the inclusion or exclusion of the iota in certain constructions, which is just a stylistic thing, really. And so it wasn't really affecting the meaning of the text in the least, and isn't really technically an error. It was a spelling variation, not that different than Shakespearean English would look different than modern English. And so that happened a lot in the ancient world, depending on where it was copied. And so when someone goes, well, how do we solve all these errors if we do have them, and again, most of them are meaningless, is because we compare manuscripts. We have so many to compare that we can work our way back really reliably to the original text. So I say, look, imagine you only had 2 copies of the New Testament and they disagreed. What would you do? Well, you would have 2 copies. One says one thing, one says the other, and then you might be in a pickle. But we have thousands upon thousands. So we can reasonably work our way back to what the original said.
Yeah, and for those who are curious, most Bible or many Bibles that you would buy today, if you buy one that has any kind of sort of footnoting, and often Bibles will have at least sort of some degree of that, they will often indicate if there is a passage or a verse or a portion of a verse where there is meaningful doubt as to whether this is the same as the original. So sometimes it will say, some of the earliest manuscripts do not contain this phrase or this word, or they phrase it differently like this. So there isn't a sort of an attempt to hide the places where we actually aren't as confident about what the original manuscript said. But correct me if I'm wrong, Mike. My understanding is that essentially no kind of Christian doctrine hangs on a text that we don't feel a pretty high degree of confidence about. So there are, a couple of longer passages in the New Testament that are disputed. One would be Jesus' forgiving of the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel, which is an incredible story that I feel a very high degree of confidence actually happened. But I think it's fair to say that many scholars are skeptical as to whether it was originally part of John's Gospel, and then the very last portion of Mark's Gospel, which, I think most scholars think is probably not originally part of what Mark wrote. But yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, that there is nothing in terms of sort of Christian teaching that actually depends on a disputed text.
No, that's right. Not only are there no Christian doctrines that hang on a text in any meaningful sense, but we only have 2 texts of substantive size of any textual variation. Most of the textual variations are a word or a spelling of a word or word order or something like this. You mentioned the 2 of any substantive size where multiple verses are involved, which is the long and Mark and story of Jesus and the adulterous woman. So you have a grand total of 2, what you might call meaningfully long textual variations, but even those aren't really impacting any doctrine. So, people have this idea that you have ancient Christian manuscripts, some say Jesus rose from the dead, and then some say he didn't, or something like this.
Right.
That's not the way it works, The type of, the message is 100% intact. And so the perspective here is really important for the listener to get. If God's goal was to make sure that historically the New Testament documents were preserved with enough integrity that you could know what they were saying about Jesus and about salvation, how to be saved and how to live as a Christian. So none of the key doctrines you have in the Christian life are in doubt because of any textual corruption. If that was God's goal, it was accomplished immensely well. We know what the text says. Now, you don't have to believe the text. Someone can say, I think it's rubbish, and I think people just made it up, and I think, it's not true. Okay, that's a whole separate argument. Someone can deny its truth. But to say we don't know what it says, or we don't know what it claims, or we don't know what Jesus claims in the Gospels because of textual variance is just not a credible argument, which is why I feel like the manuscript argument is really just not, if I were a skeptic, this is not the argument I would make. Because I don't think there's very good evidence for the case here of any meaningful corruption. I think it's a good argument to scare people. It's a good argument for rhetoric. If you want to just sort of stir up fuzziness in people's brains, it's a good argument to throw out a bunch of numbers. But if you actually want a good argument to critique Christianity, trying to say you don't have the words of the New Testament just isn't a credible argument, because I don't think it works. I think we do meaningfully have what the words say. I think the better way to critique Christianity is to say, oh, we know what Christianity claims. It's just wrong. Right. Here's why it's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I'm frustrated by. I'm like, well, just own the fact that we know what Christians believed. We know what they thought, and you can just say you think they're wrong. But that's not what you get. You get this obfuscation here with the manuscript argument that I think is a red herring at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, even for folks who are saying, oh, look, it was just made up. And I think, many people's minds, if we look at the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, they would say, oh, well, these are stories about Jesus that were exaggerated over time and maybe like made up subsequently. There was a kind of charismatic Jewish preacher who then, later generations added some miraculous healings that he did. And then, finally we end up with this idea that he was born of a virgin on the one end of his life and rose from the dead on the other. And it's all sort of an accumulation of mythology around this charismatic preacher. I think it's fair to say that just doesn't align with the history of what we can discern went on there, because the 4 gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John included in our New Testaments are all written, as far as we can tell, within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, death, and sort of claimed resurrection. So it's not that this is like generations afterwards when the story's just been sort of retold to where you couldn't possibly know what the original was. We actually have these accounts sort of pointing to living eyewitnesses at the time and sort of suggesting almost that their accounts could be verified by talking with those folks. So it's very close to the time of the events that the Gospels are recording, that they're written down. And I know British scholar Richard Balkan, one of my favorite sort of folks on these topics, suggests that one of the reasons the Gospels were written down when they were was because there was a concern that the eyewitnesses might be at risk of dying out. And so you wanted to have a kind of written record of the life and sayings and actions of Jesus so that they could be preserved with accuracy for generations to come.
No, that's exactly right. And, if someone says, hey, isn't it true that you can have a very famous figure and accumulate legends and myths about that figure and stories, and then hundreds of years later, it come together in some sort of document? I'm like, absolutely, that's possible. And we have evidence of that because we have that in folks like Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius of Tyana was supposedly a first century miracle worker who did all these amazing things. So what do we make about Apollonius? Well, the account we have of Apollonius comes from the 3rd century, from Philostratus. So we actually have an example of a first century figure who legends accrue to over time, and we have hundreds of years later our first account of that individual. But that's not true in the Gospels. As you indicated, we have 4 Gospels, all dated to the 1st century, some which quite a bit into the 1st century, which would have been around during the time of the eyewitnesses. And we would argue some of those produced by eyewitnesses, not just around during the eyewitnesses. And so when those Gospels were published, it was very risky to publish something about an historical event when people are still around. They could say, yeah, it happened that way or it didn't happen that way. Whereas if you publish a biography of Apollonius of Tyana in the 3rd century, no one's around to say, yeah, yes or no. So the situation of the Gospels is radically different than those other kinds of situations. So the proximity to the events they're purporting to record, and I think good cases to be made that the authors themselves would have had access to this material, makes the Gospels, light years different from those other types of historical sources. So, it's as good as any other historical source we have. So, again, someone would now have to come up with an explanation and saying, well, they were lying, or you have to come up with something that explains first century documents that sort of unifiably tell the story of Jesus like that. So it's very different than the type of things that you were alluding to.
The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/gettyhymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. Yeah, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the earliest texts that we have that are included in the New Testament aren't actually the Gospels, but probably some of Paul's letters. Is that right? And one of the interesting things about Paul's letters is he tends to major on Jesus' resurrection. And so you would think if you were building up a kind of mythologization of a historical character, you might start with, they did some healing miracles. And then you might sort of get more and more exaggerated over time. And eventually you might come up with the idea that they rose from the dead. But that probably wouldn't be the very first thing. That's a pretty dramatic claim to make about somebody. And it seems like the very earliest sort of writings that we have about Jesus are making this outrageous claim that he was crucified and then actually physically rose from the dead on the 3rd day after that. So it just doesn't really fit with this kind of mythologized over time vision that people have, when somebody writing very close to his claim. Yeah,
the way Paul does that is interesting too, because really the key passage here, of course, is 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says the story of the resurrection. And what's interesting is that when Paul frames that whole discussion on the resurrection, he makes it very clear that he's inherited earlier tradition. What I received, I pass on to you, that Christ died according to the scriptures and was raised again and appeared to the 12 and to James and to me and to 500 other witnesses. What's interesting about that tradition is almost all scholars agree that whatever Paul's describing there about the resurrection of Jesus, not only does it describe the resurrection, but it predates Paul. So our earliest source is Paul in the 50s, but he's inheriting tradition that goes back well into the 40s, and some would even say into the late 30s. About Jesus' resurrection. So now you have the resurrection going back to the earliest strata you can of the early Christian movement, which, as you indicated, maybe you could imagine coming up with some claims that dramatic later, but the idea that you'd claim that from the start. And Paul doesn't just do this with the resurrection. He also does this with his claims about Jesus' divinity, that his idea that he is the Lord incarnate. We can tend to think that the divinity came later, right? He started off as a man in people's minds, and eventually they started attributing things to him, and then eventually they thought he was God. That's also not the order of things, because Paul, in a number of his other passages, has earlier tradition that he's received that really indicates the full and unequivocal deity of Jesus, not a half God, not a semi-God, but really the God of the Old Testament enfleshed. And I'm thinking here about passages like Philippians 2, 1 Corinthians 8, and others, where Paul clearly has the highest view of Jesus' divinity you could have at one of the earliest stages. So now you have a high view of his divinity and a high view of the resurrection in the earliest strata of the faith, as far back as you could take an historical source. And so now someone could say, yeah, I still don't believe it. That's fine. You don't have to believe things. No one's forcing you to. But to say there's no historical credibility is a very different thing. No, there is historical credibility there. And I would say there's historical probability there. Even if someone in the end refuses to acquiesce to it, that's fine. You don't have to believe things you don't feel like you want to believe, but that's different than claiming there's no basis for the belief. Christians have a basis for the belief. It's pretty obvious what it is.
Yeah, and one of the things that you'll notice if you sit down and read through the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is quite how embarrassing they are for the early Christian leaders. So Jesus sort of famously recruited this troop of 12 apostles and a larger group of disciples as well, both men and women. But the apostles who went on to be key leaders in the early Christian movement really don't come out of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life well at all. And you'd sort of think, like, if there was a political power move being made by, let's say, Peter, who emerges as one of the kind of key leaders of the early Christian movement, and if he was sort of trying to massage things in a way that would be good for early Christian PR, why on earth he would include the story of him denying that he even knew Jesus 3 times the night that Jesus betrayed to his death? I mean, it's profoundly embarrassing. And the number of times where Jesus' apostles basically look stupid, or like they haven't really listened to what Jesus was saying. Jesus says, he tells them he's going to be crucified, and they start arguing about which of them is greater. Like, it's really embarrassing. And you sort of think, if these stories weren't true, why would they have been included? Like, this terrible PR for the early Christian leaders, you'd think that they would have done something about it if they could, except that unless their point was to say, actually, we're fine with looking like sinful fools because we're pointing to Jesus, who is the only perfect human who's ever walked this earth. I think there's a kind of a ring of truth in the bad PR that the Gospels are for the apostles. What would you say, Mike, to someone who says, okay, look, I understand that you're claiming that the 4 Gospels included in our Bibles have decent sort of historical support around them. But what about all those other Gospels that were not included in the Bible? Like, isn't there something sort of fishy there? When we have other stories and documents about Jesus' life that didn't make it into the New Testament?
Yeah, great question. And before I take it, let me just comment on your prior point about the embarrassing nature of the material in the Gospels, because I do think that's a really important point for people to get. And it's not restricted to just the Gospels. I would say that Christianity as a whole, if you read the Bible and the whole ethos of it, is sort of very raw and real. You don't get this sense that even the Old Testament sanitized the patriarchs or sanitized the saints of old, or made everybody look good. There's a sense of sort of the messiness of Christians and of even followers of Jesus that should be refreshing to people who want authenticity and don't want a religion that's just sort of whitewashed. That, like, there's something real here. I think the Gospels show that. I mean, there's other embarrassing parts too. I mean, Jesus' own family thought he was crazy. Yeah. And we have these reports of his own brothers and sisters disowning him. I mean, that's not helping your cause here. And so, but that's all included, right? And so I think there's something to that. Now, when someone says, okay, fine, so the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, maybe have some basis for historical truth, but it looks like Christians just excluded these other Gospels that they didn't like. And this seems to be peculiar and self-serving and seems to be shutting out other voices. So the argument goes. Well, that argument's been made. There's people that make it sound like a conspiracy theory, right? Like all these Gospels are equal in their credibility and equal in their historical value, and that some group that's in power got a hold and picked the ones they liked and then oppressed and probably even burned the ones they didn't like. But actually, that's not at all the reason those other Gospels are not in our Bibles. The reason those other Gospels are not in our Bibles is actually amazingly simple. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only Gospels that can be dated to the century in which Jesus lived. They're the earliest Gospels we have, and the only ones that go back to the beginning and back to the original followers of Jesus. Every other so-called apocryphal or lost gospel out there is dated to the 2nd century or later. And here's what's interesting. Even secular scholars agree with this. Even they agree that they're dated 2nd century or later. But if you take something like the Gospel of Thomas, right, that supposedly is written by Thomas, one of the 12, almost everyone agrees now it was probably written in the late 2nd century by someone other than Thomas, pretending to be Thomas. So why didn't that make it in our Bibles? Because everybody knew it was a forgery. Everyone knew that it was not really from Thomas, and it doesn't go back to the first century. It doesn't give you a credible eyewitness testimony to the first century realities. And these lost gospels often portray, or actually often betray, their lack of historical knowledge. They mess up data about first century Palestine. They mess up geography. They mess up the nature of first century Judaism. They mess up the way ancient Jewish culture worked, because they're so far removed that you can tell that they're written so late. And the Gospel of Peter is notorious for this, another lost gospel that purportedly goes back to Peter, but was written in the 2nd century by someone who was not Peter. And it's evidently late and evidently embellished. So why don't these other gospels get included? Well, I think the early Christians just recognized that they weren't historical. They didn't go back to the time of the apostles.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And another slant that people sometimes put on this is to say, oh, well, these lost gospels that were excluded from the Bible portray a more kind of feminist view of Jesus and of Christianity, drawing on the fact that there'll be some sort of prominence to Mary Magdalene in some of these accounts. My two...
Not Thomas.
Right. So my two pennyworth on that would be, number one, if you actually read them, you will find they're a whole lot less feminist than they're portrayed to be. I'm guessing, Mike, you're thinking of the end of the Gospel of Thomas, where, what is it? Is it Peter who says, let Mary depart for women are not worthy of life? And Jesus says something like, I myself will lead her so that she could become male for anyone. Only if you're male can you enter the kingdom of God, or words to that effect. Yeah,
Logion 114, any woman that becomes male will enter the kingdom of heaven. And so there's a clearly very negative view of women there. Now, other scholars have a different take on that, and that's a larger conversation, but it's clearly not obviously feminist. And then I would also respond by saying, if someone wants to find a religion that's warm and welcoming to women, I think the historic early Christianity was exactly that. Because I think Jesus was that. And I argued in my book, Christianity at the Crossroads, that was actually a defining mark of the early Christian movement, as it was really popular among women. So the idea that early Christianity was sort of anti-woman and we need modern and later versions to get there is, I think, again, a misunderstanding of the way it was historically.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if you read through the gospel accounts, you will often find that the stories are depending on the testimony of women, or that they are portraying Jesus' relationships with women in a really interesting and significant way. So whether that's Luke's gospel, which name drops, well, A tells the story of Jesus's sort of conception and birth very much from the perspective of the women involved in it, or whether it's the middle of Luke's gospel, where I think in Luke chapter 8, he cites the names of 3 women in particular who are among Jesus' itinerant disciples, Mary Magdalene, Mary, Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, sort of 3 women who Luke is citing as sort of authoritative for some of the stories that he's telling. And then obviously toward the end of all of the 4 gospels, they're pointing to the key role that women played in witnessing the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. Or if you look at John's gospel and you find in John 4, the longest recorded private conversation Jesus has with anybody in all of the gospels is with not only a woman, but a Samaritan woman, so a woman from a racial and religious group that Jews of Jesus' day had been raised to hate. And on top of that, a Samaritan woman who'd had 5 husbands and is now living with a man who's not her husband. So sort of Jesus has his longest private recorded conversation with a woman who, from the standards of his day, he shouldn't have been seen dead with, quite frankly. And yet we kind of see this offer that he makes to her of living water. So yeah, I'd encourage anybody who's wondering about the role of women in Christianity to actually sort of read through the Gospels and see what you see there.
And I would add to that, those are all classic places where Jesus engages with women so positively. And I would add to that a number of stories where in the Gospels, the sort of, if I could use the term, hero of that certain story is female. In other words, there's so many stories where Jesus interacts with people. And almost time and time again, I just finished a long study of Mark doing this. Time and time again, it's amazing how many women end up emerging in a particular story as the positive character in the story. You know, whether it's the woman who comes in and with the alabaster jar, Jesus commends her for her awareness of his death, anointing him for his death, obviously embracing his death, where everyone else doesn't want anything to do with his death. Or whether it's the widow who gives her final money into the jar at the temple. There's so many stories where it could be the woman whose faith grabbed the garment of Jesus and was healed. There's an amazing number of stories where if you're just paying attention, you're like, wait a second. I'm amazed at how many stories have multiple figures in it, but the people who emerge with this positively are female. And so if someone says Christianity is sort of not anti-female, I'm like, I don't know that you've really read the sources here, because the sources aren't pointing that way. And as I said in my book, Christianity at the Crossroads, the early Christian movement attracted to women. I think they read the sources as they were. They found it to be a very welcoming home, and particularly in contradistinction to the Greco-Roman world and how they treated women, which you want to talk about problems. That was a place they wanted to get out of as quickly as they could.
Yeah. I think my favorite example to add to your list there, Mike, is in Luke's gospel, when Luke tells us that a sinful woman of the city comes in when Jesus is over at a Pharisee's house having dinner and starts weeping on Jesus' feet and wiping his feet with her hair and sort of pouring ointment on them. And this is super embarrassing, frankly. And the Pharisee, the sort of religious, very sort of strictly religious Jewish man who is hosting Jesus, and he was interestingly given a name. So he's Simon the Pharisee, and this woman is anonymous, a sinful woman of the city. You might expect from the setup that Simon the Pharisee would come out looking golden and the woman not so much. He's appalled by the fact that Jesus isn't telling this woman to go away, and in fact seems to be welcoming this woman with this whatever she's doing. And then Jesus tells a story which basically shames Simon for his behavior and holds the woman up as an example of love. So you get this kind of utter reversal of what you might expect.
And that happens over and over and over again. If like I said, if the readers paid attention to that is not, you can't just sort of say that's incidental. That's central to sort of a mission of Jesus. It crosses all these sociological barriers, right? So it crosses over from Jew to Gentile, crosses over from male to female, crosses over from rich to poor. There's when Paul says later in Galatians 3, so in Christ there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, nor slave nor free. That's like an embodiment of this sort of transnational religion of Christianity that just was completely perplexing to the Greco-Roman world, that had an idea of what religion should be. And Christianity fit none of the categories, because you don't have religions that are monotheistic that do what Christianity does. You're going to all the nations, to all these different groups. And that's what was so frustrating to the early Romans, and what's so amazing about it to Christians, right? In fact, so common were Christians crossing these barriers, they were often mocked for it. So, Celsus famously mocks Christianity for being a religion of women and children. And he thought it was an insult. We're as Christians like, no, that's exactly what it's trying to be. It's trying to be a religion for everybody.
Yeah.
And that's what it was.
So last question for you, Mike. You've mentioned a couple of poor objections that people might have to Christianity. And I'm curious, what would you say for you personally is the biggest reason you have for believing that Christianity is true?
Yeah, that's such an interesting and wide open question, because there's so many things that I think have convinced me of the truth of Christianity. Sort of operating as an historian and as a scholar of early Christianity, I certainly am just regularly impressed by the historical credentials of the Gospels and how much they stand up to critique in terms of whether they really fit sort of a first century sort of Palestinian world milieu. And I think time and time again, they prove themselves. And I suppose I could talk about that in the regularity in which the Gospels sort of vindicate themselves. But I think the thing that's most convincing to me, and this is going to sound more subjective coming from a historian, right? You expect me to list out like hardcore data, but this is a sense of hardcore data. Is I just don't think anybody could have made up the person of Jesus. I look at the person of Jesus and I'm thinking, this individual, this person, his character, his insight, his actions, his words, you can't help but yet be utterly mesmerized by who this person is and realize there's more to this person than just a great teacher, that he is the embodiment of something divine. And I challenge anybody. You look at the person of Jesus in terms of his character, his witness, his teachings, his self sort of declarations of his own identity, and how that squares with the identity of Yahweh in the Old Testament, and start seeing all the links and connections. And I can't help but think there's no one else like this on the planet. Human beings don't make up guys like that. And so once you realize the uniqueness of Jesus, and I think everything starts like a puzzle, starts fitting together, because everything fits together around him and his distinctiveness and his uniqueness. And Scripture does that, theology does that, everything does that around him. So embracing the uniqueness of Jesus, I think, is the starting point to realizing why Christianity is Christianity.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Mike. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on Twitter/X or Instagram. You could leave a review on iTunes with a topic that you'd like to see explored in a forthcoming episode. We'd love that. And between now and next time I speak into your earphones, if you haven't, as an adult, sat down and read through one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, one of the first century biographies that Mike and I have been talking about, then why not do that? Why not grab a Bible and read through either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and see what you make of this man who, Mike, as somebody who's studied the history of the time in quite some depth, says that no human being could have made up.